Scott Acantino.
¿Sí?
Scott Acantino. Le hago admit. Pues ahí dice admit, que yo le pique.
¿Cuál es admin?
No sé. Me sale Scott Acantino can center the waiting room for this meeting. Y que yo le pique admit. Es raro, ¿verdad?
Es que a lo mejor ellos... Es que yo lo mandé como friend.
Host, Frank Guso.
Sí. No.
Two people are entered with the waiting room in this meeting.
¿Quiénes son?
Scott y Dario. Y Alan Tardy. Dicen que yo los agregue. No sé por qué.
Porque yo mandé con el email de Frank. Ahí. Pues vale, sí.
Mira. Admin.
Pone admin todo.
Okay.
Sí, pues tú eres Frank Guzzo.
Es raro.
Pues no le haga recording. Páralo para ahorita, Jennifer.
Ciao Dario.
Perfetto.
Francesco.
Contesta.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Come andiamo?
Ciao Dario.
Ciao.
Com'è?
Bene, tu?
Ma andiamo avanti.
Come fa freddo là?
Com'è?
Fa freddo?
Ma l'audio non è molto buono, eh?
No. Aspetta. Vediamo un po' il mio audio. Mi senti meglio?
Sì, adesso sì.
Perfetto.
Sono già un co-host. Posso condividere la...
Penso di sì, perché non provi?
Provo, via. No.
Aspetta allora. Prova adesso.
Adesso sì, grazie.
Perfetto. Eccolo qua.
Voilà. Non ho cambiato il foto. È sempre il Trentino.
Sempre bella.
Beh, sì. Dai. Facciamo già la ripresa audio.
No.
Perché
Non lo so. Sì, sembra di sì.
Sembra di
Aspetta
sì.
che la staccalo.
Sì.
Perché non vale la pena adesso. Still recording?
Sembra di sì.
Yeah,
Welcome
go on, go for it.
and we're recording. Great. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Toscana, a very important region in terms of wine, certainly, also in terms of Italy. I mean, not just for the region, but Italy in general. Toscana is very significant. It kind of helped put Italian wine on the map for many people. Just kind of a quick review of what we talked about in the last two sessions, because we're going to be getting into a lot of this stuff today. The Italian appellation system, DOC, and DOCG was begun in 1963. And the first DOC appellation started to appear started to be created in 1966. And the first DOCGs around 1980. And we'll look at some of those. The system was really overhauled significantly in 2009, 2010 to make the revisions we talked about. Here's our pyramid that we spoke about before. We have this breakdown so we're not talking too much about generic wines, which are wines without any geographical origin. If you like, there's another category of generic wines where you can include the vintage and in some cases the grape variety, but these are only international grapes. And I think that the Italian officials did that so as not to sort of confuse any of the real kind of typical important regional grapes like Sangiovese or Nebbiolo. You cannot do a generic wine using and putting Nebbiolo on the label, because as we talked about in Piemonte, for example, a very important grape variety for Piemonte, and there are no IGTs, much less generic wines coming out of Piedmont. So we're not really talking too much about that. But up in the upper part of the pyramid, we have these two different distinctions, PGI and PDO. PGI, or in Italian, they use the original term IGT, Indicazione Geografiche Tipica. And then there's the PDO, which is the DOC and DOCG appellation. So we're going to see a lot of this dynamic in Tuscany when we get into the wines there. So just remember that, that distinction. So just a very brief recap of Tuscany. I think way back in the beginning with us 3 weeks ago, we talked about sort of the ancient origins of Italy, the Etruscan tribes, which were located actually right in the area we're looking at today, Tuscany and Umbria. That was sort of the center of the Etruscans. They spread up and they spread to the north and they spread down to the south. Then in the south, of course, the ancient Greeks created some settlements in southern Italy, Sicily and Campania chiefly, but some other places as well. Then the Etruscans found their way down there, and so the ancient Greeks met the ancient Etruscans, and then later on is you see Rome on the map, indicated on the map there. The ancient Romans were a tribe, the Latini from Lazio area. They grew in importance and influence, and their kingdom expanded up to the north and down to the south, where they met this Greek and Etruscan combination of viticulture and culture in general, and they adopted that along with Greek mythology, and they expanded their empire out all over the place. Then now this brings us to where we are looking at today. The Roman Empire collapsed around 476. And with that, you had a lot of invasions of tribes mostly from the north, the Franks and the Lombards, and who in some cases made settlements in the Italian peninsula. But this we kind of call the Dark Ages, when there's a lot of chaos going on compared to under the country, the area under the Roman influence, where everything was kind of organized and they had their sort of society that they were spreading out. When that fell apart, there was a long period of chaos from 476, 500, right up until the early Renaissance period, 1300s, like the Middle Ages, when these city-states started to form. These were like cities developed in different places throughout the Italian peninsula, and there were noble families, important families that kind of consolidated the power, and they became their own individual separate states. And they developed very far, and especially, and this is where Tuscany becomes very important, in the mid 1500s, the Renaissance, what we call the Renaissance period, the rebirth started to take place, and one of the real centers of that was in Tuscany. There, we had the noble family there were the Medici, and they were very strong, very influential dynasty, very powerful and very wealthy, and they were able to support a lot of this knowledge that was developing. We think of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. This was all happening there, and many other things: science, arts, culture. So in Tuscany, you can see here, we can see this map of Renaissance Italy around the 1500s. There was the Duchy of Milan, the Duchy of Savoy in the upper left side. So remember, the Savoy were a noble family, a family of counts from the Savoy Mountains in France, who acquired the Kingdom of Sardinia. They were very good maneuverers, like many people who are powerful and important, politically and in other ways. They so of course they were very important. The Duchy of Modena, the Duchy of Ferrara. So these were all individual. They weren't countries, but they were states. They were self-governed, and they had their own culture and their own architecture, and in many cases their own language, and they talked with one another and vied for power between one another. But the very, very important things were going on during this period in Tuscany, and especially with the Medici influence there. Now, when it comes to wine, of course, that's what we're here to talk about. But as I mentioned from the outset, history and culture does really impact very strongly on wine, especially, I would say, in Italy, but pretty much everywhere else. So 1716, Cosimo III issued an edict delineating 5 different wine growing areas. And this was very interesting. Now, he didn't create them, but he issued an edict, a bando, sort of protecting them, delineating the boundaries of these 5 different areas, and really protecting them and saying this is an established wine growing area, and these are the boundaries of it, and this is what kind of what you have to do in that area. And if you look over here, one of them was Chianti. And if you look at that, so this is 1716. Now he didn't invent this. Once again, these names were already quite old, but here is the area of Chianti. Now we call this Chianti Classico. We'll look at that on a map very shortly. But you can see some other names of places within Chianti here as well. Greve, for example, Panzano, Rada, Gaiole, Castellina and Chianti. These are places that were identified then as being part of this Chianti area, and they're still very much identified now. So here we are, Toscana. There it is, in case you had any doubts, borders the Ligurian Sea. It's a fairly large region, and it's one of these fulcrum regions that kind of goes from the north to central. It kind of touches upon the northern part, and reaches down to central Italy. And of course, this is where you can see central Italy, the Etruscans in Tuscany and in Umbria, and then the Latini tribes in Lazio just below that. So when we talk about wine, as I mentioned from the outset, Tuscany is very important. It has a large number of wine growing areas and important wines, but it really made a big impact on Italian wine in general, both in the outside world, and what was happening in Tuscany also had a big impact on the rest of Italy as well. So it's very prolific. There's a lot of appellations here. You can see PDO appellations, 34 DOCs, 6 DOCGs, and a lot of sort of subcategories within them. And some of these are, of course, some of the very best, most widely known appellations, and we're going to look at them, of course. Uh, and importantly, we'll talk maybe a little bit about this. This was one of the places where a big, I wouldn't say, sometimes we say revolution, and it was in some cases, but it was really more of an evolution. This whole sort of revitalization of Italian wine, a big step up in terms of improvement of quality. Not that they were terrible necessarily before, but people really started to focus on quality rather than quantity. And we have to think about this. This started to happen in the late 60s perhaps, but really 1970s into the 80s. After World War II, Italy was devastated, was in a big shambles, and really had to make a big effort to come back. And they managed to do that. It was really kind of like the renaissance of a country because they got the economy going back again. And one of the things of that was wine. They were cheap wines. They were marketable wines, but they were wines that were being exported and at least putting Italy on the map as far as a modern day wine producing country, and also generating some income for the country. Later on, so it was about quantity. It was about producing wine and getting it out into the market and trying to make a living and get the vineyards back in shape. After that, there was another kind of revolution, this sort of, as I mentioned, about, people saying, okay, we can produce wine, but why don't we take it a notch higher and produce good quality wine? In many cases, that means reducing the yields of grapes from the vineyards rather than maximizing them. We can do that, but we want to really focus more on quality, and many producers did that, and many of them were located in Tuscany. That went on for a while. The AOC system, DOC system was established. People were starting to create appellations, and a decade or two went on. A new generation, the children whose parents were the ones who were, either fighting in or young people during World War II, who came back and kind of got the wineries going again. Now they had their children were getting involved in the winery, and of course, young people have different vision of things. They have a different point of view, a different perspective, and they wanted to try to do some new things. So they wanted to go out of the box. They found some of these DOC regulations a little bit restrictive. We'll talk a little bit about that, but that was very important. For in Tuscany too, that was one of the hotbeds of this kind of new viticultural movement that was taking place. One was in Piedmont, one was in Tuscany, and then there were some other isolated places too throughout the country. So very interesting cultural background, and that really impacts on the wine. But another big impact on wine, of course, is topography. Look at it. So here we are. Central Italy. You can see this is the region of Tuscany, but look at it. It's going right down on the right side of your screen, which is towards the east. You see the Apennine Mountains, and that's the spine of the peninsula. That's one of the boundaries of the region of Tuscany, and then it goes into other regions on the other side. But this really defines the wine growing area. So you see a big coastal area. There's some intermediate hills there that are in very key areas. And then up into the mountains. So it's really defined by this particular growing area. You get a lot of these breezes off of the Mediterranean, or in this case, the Ligurian Sea, and then they go up into the hills and they stop at the mountains. So that is really sort of the definition of the wine growing area, and very important. A lot of wine regions, and you can see them. There are some coastal areas there. We're not going to be looking at all of them because remember, we're following the Classico portfolio. But you can see some very diversified areas. And we'll take a look at each one by one. One of them that really stands out there is, of course, Chianti, right in the middle of the area. Now, this is the Chianti Classico area. This is essentially the area that Cosimo Medici III mapped out in is one of his wine growing areas in 1716. And it's very much adheres to that today. Let's take a closer look at it. So in this case, Chianti Classico is considered the place where the wine that we now know of as Chianti originated, the birthplace of Chianti. And in fact, the term Classico is used by many other regions in Italy to designate a place where a wine originated and then it expanded out of that. So this is sort of like one of the early examples of it. Others of them are Valpolicella Classico, for example. There's a defined area where it's kind of like the heart, the original birthplace of the area, and then there's the expanded area. And same thing with Soave and a number of other areas. And as I mentioned, we talked about before, one of the Chianti, now we call it Chianti Classico, this original growing area, was one of the first cases of what we could really refer to as an appellation. Not just in Tuscany, but this is really one of the first in Italy and in many other places where it is an official, clearly delineated place name of origin. It's also protected by the delineation. So what happened? Eventually, from this kind of heartbeat area in the center where it originated, it expanded outwards. People were growing the same types of vine, and they started making the same types of wine. So this became sort of considered to be the Chianti area in general. Much larger area. This is this sort of kind of pink fleshy area, and everything else that is indicated there. Within the greater area of Chianti, there are 7 subzones. And we'll take a look at those. But within Chianti Classico itself, there are 9 towns. There we go. Each of which has its own character to some extent within the Classico area. And so from Chianti, originally, the Chianti Classico was really the original one that was created. Then the expanded area got a DOC, and Chianti Classico was one of the subzones of the Chianti area. They didn't really like that, so they made it elevated it into its own DOCG appellation in 1996. And what does that mean? The regulations for Chianti Classico DOCG are much more stringent than other Chianti appellations. It does require a minimum of 80% Sangiovese. You can use more of that. At one point in time, one of the things that many people rebelled against in Chianti was the mandated use of a certain percentage of white grapes in the Chianti blend. Some people didn't want to do that. There were reasons why it was done traditionally and why it was part of the Chianti appellation. But some people didn't want to do that, and so that was one of the things that induced them to start producing great wines outside of the category of Chianti, because they said we don't need the appellation. We would rather make wines from this area the way we want to make them, in this case without the use of white grapes. So and this is one of the things that was also adopted by the Chianti Classico DOCG appellation, that for them now white grapes are prohibited, when one of the big problems was they were obligatory before. So a lot of wines here, and we'll go through them pretty quickly. There's some more after this, but we have you can see minimum 80% is mandated. Some of them are 100, some of them are 80%. You can blend other grape varieties. You see, and I'll just go through kind of sporadically through the different ones to point out some of the differences. Here, Dannalora is 85% Sangiovese with 15% Merlot, not typical of the area, of course, not traditional, but one of the approved varieties. Whereas Stefano Farina uses 95% Sangiovese with 5% Canaiolo. Now, Canaiolo we see cropping up a lot in Chianti, And in fact, this was originally the most important grape variety that was grown there. Sangiovese was kind of took second place to that. Then the tables got turned a little bit, but still a very important grape variety, and it really gives structure and kind of some kind of earthy boundaries to shape the Sangiovese, which is a little bit more fruit forward and has a little bit more body to it, shall we say. Another thing that we'll talk about as we go through is, so one thing is the uvaggio, the blending of different grape varieties where it is permitted. Some appellations based on Sangiovese, it's not permitted to do blends, but we'll take a look at those. So one of them is the grape varieties, the blend of grape varieties that is chosen, and that makes a big difference on the overall flavor. Another is where they come from. We'll be looking at that whenever we can. If it's a single, if it comes from one particular place. If you look at Cafaggio on the left side, this is not a subzone. It's not indicated on the label. However, all of these Sangiovese grapes, 100%, come from the area, the hamlet of Panzano in the area of Greve, which is one of the classic areas. So that's important, just where they come from, even though it's not an indication on the label. Another important thing is the aging regimen. So how long do they age, and how long and how? There is, of course, this is a red wine, so there's always going to be a maceration period, the amount of time that the crushed grapes spend in contact with the must, with the liquid that is then going to become wine. But how long does that take place? How long is the maceration? How much color and tannin do they want to extract out of the grapes? Another thing is the aging regimen. How long does it age following the fermentation process? All makes a big difference. So you see the second one, Donna Laura, 10% of the wine is aged in tonneaux, which are 500 liter barrels. I'm not going to spell it out all the time, but usually if we're talking about barrique, they're 225 liters. Then there are variations, 205 in Champagne or 228 in Bordeaux, but typically 225 liters for a barrique, a small French barrel with thin wood. Otherwise, you can use what we call large casks of Slavonian oak. They have a different aging impact on the wine. And then how long? Now you can also see here, I just made a note, Le Bocce Stefano Farina. We saw him last week in Piemonte. They have 5 estates. 2 of them are in Piedmont. I think they have 2 here in Tuscany, and then there's 1 or 2 down in the south. So he turns up again, and his winery is located in Tuscany, in Panzano, also in Greve di Chianti. So this is where a lot of the grapes are sourced, even though it's not indicated on the label. We will be looking at some village wines. So now we're going to go into regular Chianti. So the larger area. Here's what it looks like, and this is the sort of larger Chianti area that's spread out from the Classico. And there are 7 official subzones centering around 7 towns. So I'm just going to number them here: Chianti Colli Fiorentini, Chianti Colli Senesi, Chianti Rufina, Chianti Colli Aretini. Now this is around Arezzo. You see Chianti Colli Senesi is in the vicinity of Siena. Montalbano, Chianti Colline Pisani near Pisa, and Chianti Montespertoli, which is the most recent addition to the subzones. I think we can say now each town has its own sort of reputation and characteristics to some extent. Fiorentini and Colli Senesi were 2 of the most historic, of course, because they center around 2 of the most important towns in in Tuscany, Firenze and Siena. They were for quite a while rivals. They used to fight among each other, and they were very competitive. And there was, that's the whole. There's a story of how the Chianti Classico region came about. It has to do with a race of two knights and some roosters and racing to kind of get there first and determine the boundary. So they're both very much a part of the Chianti Classico area. There are a lot of places within the township of Firenze and also of Siena that are even though they're, of course, part of it is Chianti Colicinese, but also part of it is in the Classico area as well. The important thing for us is that within the Chianti DOCG, so not Chianti Classico, but Chianti DOCG appellation, there are, if all of the grapes come from one of these 7 subzones, the name of that town or that area can be listed on the label. And that's significant because it's just a level of geographic specificity. It doesn't have sort of the cachet, if you will, of Chianti Classico being the birthplace of the area. However, it is a subzone, a defined subzone within the overall Chianti DOCG area. First, we're going to take a very quick look at a Chianti Colicinese from Carpinetta Fontalpino. So their winery is located in the town of Castelnuovo Baradenga, which is one of the towns of Chianti Classico. But it is also part of the Chianti Colicinese area. So it depends on where the vineyards are situated, and also, to some extent, which protocol do you want to follow. Winery was created in 1967. They have about 27 hectares. They follow organic principles. Here, the soil in this area and in a lot of areas of the southern part of Chianti Classico and of Siena, sandy, clay, pebbly soil. So this one is 100% Sangiovese, medium textured soil with some kind of alluvial deposits which come from rivers. And this one is, there's no wood aging on it. It's a wine that is meant to be consumed fairly young, fresh, simple, which doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It's just you don't always want a big structured wine that's been aged for a long time. And so this is a good example of a Chianti Colicinese, this from this area of Siena. So, and I actually think it's the only one that we have in the portfolio to look at, I believe. So here are a number of different Chianti DOCGs from different areas. Now, even if they don't list a subzone on the area, they still come from somewhere. So you see up here, the Tenuta La Vigna. Here, the winery is based in San Gimignano. So there's a different type of soil makeup in that area. Yellow sand, clay mixed with stones. They also do a very sort of interesting aging regimen, 6 months in cement and glass tanks. So there's no wood involved. There's some aging period to kind of have the wine settle and rest and take on some oxygen very slowly. Cement gives a little bit of very slow exchange of oxygen. Glass, if it's sealed, nothing, of course. So, obviously this is going to be a kind of a low impact aging. It's another wine that's meant to be drunk sort of young and simple, as we could say, Vernaccia di San Gimignano, great white wine from this particular town. The first appellation to achieve a DOC status in 1966. There were many others that got an appellation in 1966, but Vernaccia di San Gimignano got it first. Some other interesting places here. Let's see, Chianti Classico Donna Laura, once again in Castelnuovo Baradenga. We looked at it before around the Siena area. This winery will come out a number of times. We have this one. It's a Reserva, so requires more, mandates more time aging. This one is 2 years, a Reserva Chianti Reserva normal. 2 years of aging with at least 12 months in oak, and this one does that, and another year in bottle, and this one uses large oak casks. Another very interesting, and they're also located in Greve, a very important town within the classical area, as we saw. One of the original towns mentioned in the Edict of 1716. There's something interesting here. La Ginestra is also another Stefano Farina property. It's called Fattoria Albaretto in the town of Arezzo. So this would be under could be used under the sub-zone Chianti Colli Aretini, but this one does not indicate that. But they mentioned something very interesting. So here is 90% Sangiovese, 10% Canaiolo. And they say that it goes through a second fermentation by adding previously pressed grapes to the grape must or to the just finished wine. It's very interesting, and I looked at it on their site in both English and Italian. The Italian doesn't specify any clearer what they mean by that. They do say it's an old traditional practice. And there is indeed an old traditional practice called Governo Toscano, which involves adding clusters of dried grapes into a wine that is in the process of fermentation or stuck fermentation to kind of get it going again. Because what this does is by adding grapes into either a very young wine that's just finished fermentation or one that is kind of in the process of fermentation, getting towards the later part of fermentation, and maybe it stops or maybe it needs a boost to keep going, they would add a bunch of grapes into this wine to kind of restart the fermentation process. So it kind of sounds like what they're doing. If they're doing something, maybe they press these dried out grapes. They would be dried because you're doing it later on in the process. But maybe they press the grapes and just added the liquid, perhaps, or really the Governo Toscano is a whole bunch, just kind of tossing it in there to reactivate the fermentation process. So, and it actually makes it it has an impact on the flavor of the wine. It's an old practice that very few people are using now, and if they are, even fewer of them admit it. But an interesting note there on their winemaking. Moving into another very important appellation, Montepulciano. Here, there are a lot of montes, if you may have noticed that, because there are hills, a lot of hills in the area. And remember the topographical map. This is kind of a hilly area. And where we don't see hills, we see the kind of flat areas, and that permits the breezes from the sea to blow in a bit. So Montepulciano is another very old wine growing area that apparently was highly appreciated by important people, nobility, people high up in the church. It requires, and it's based on a grape variety. It turns out to be the same grape variety as Sangiovese. However, here was always known as Prugnolo Gentile because it had different different characteristics to it. It showed differently. The type of Sangiovese that was growing in Montepulciano and still was noticeably different for people than the one that was growing in other nearby areas, and they gave it their own different name. Anyway, in this appellation of Montepulciano requires a minimum of 70% Sangiovese. And there are two appellations of Montepulciano. One is Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, DOCG, right, the higher level. And the other is Rosso di Montepulciano, DOC, I believe. I should have put that in there. Same growing area, same producers. The Rosso is a younger version of the Vino Nobile, and it's very important because we talked about it last week in Piedmont. This creates a sort of two-tier system with the same grape variety, same grower in the same area. In Piedmont, we saw the Langhe Nebbiolo produced from Nebbiolo grapes in the area of specifically of, well, Langhe, a very big area, but many producers in Barolo produce a Langhe Nebbiolo because they don't want to use those grapes for Barolo. So they can declassify the Nebbiolo for Barolo in the area if the vintage is not quite up to snuff, and do, you know, a very nice Nebbiolo-based wine, but less structured, doesn't age as long, doesn't follow those protocols. And the same thing happens here. We'll see it. We'll see this mirrored again shortly. But Rosso di Montepulciano is like sort of a little brother, if you will, a first tier of Vino Nobile. So if you don't really feel like spending the money, you're drinking a big important wine like Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, you want something, you know, for pizza or pasta or something like that on a weeknight, Rosso di Montepulciano is an excellent possibility for that. And it's also a great way to get to know a particular producer. If you're trying someone new, you might not want to spring, you know, for the big bucks or bigger bucks for Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. So let's, you know, try their Rosso first, because that'll give you a good indication of their winemaking style and the specific area which within the Montepulciano growing area where they work. So that's very important, and keep that in mind. Before we start talking about Montepulciano, we'll talk a moment about Avignonese, a producer based in Montepulciano for a long time. I just recently found out that that this winery, I knew the people there quite well, 10 or 15 or more years ago. It had been part of the Avignonese family for a long time. The estate was purchased in 2009 by a woman from Belgium who studied law in Paris. Must have done quite well, because she moved to Tuscany in 2007 and wanted to buy a winery, and she bought this one. And it sounds like she's doing some very interesting things there, converting it to first organic and then biodynamic practices. And so what that means is that Avignonese is now the largest biodynamic estate in all of Italy. They have 175 hectares, a vineyard, and a brand new winery. So congratulations. So we're talking about Avignonese because they're a very important producer in Vino Nobile. They are one of the wineries that really helped put that area on the map to the extent that it is. Many people overlook it. They go for another very important wine that begins with M and it starts with M and ends with O, but which is great. We'll talk about that shortly. But Vino Nobile is also a very compelling wine that is based on Sangiovese, here known as Prugnolo Gentile. So, and Avignonese was, I believe that they still are one of the big protagonists of this wine. Now here you can see the stepping stone from 1, 2, and 3 in some ways. So first we have the Rosso di Montepulciano, 100% Sangiovese, 15-day fermentation and maceration, only 6 months in oak, and then it sits in bottle for 3 months to let it kind of settle and mature, refine, as we say. Moving into the Vino Nobile, 100% Sangiovese, again, spontaneous fermentation. So that means it they're not inoculating, they're not adding yeast to the grape must to initiate a fermentation process. It happens on their own, and they do that in a very interesting way. They have this what they call fermentation room tini, which is a type of fermentation tank al vento. So they're outside. There's a roof over them, but not sitting on top of them. So they're covered, but open. And that is to kind of capture the yeast that is floating around in a vineyard area and also in winery areas during the latter part of maturation, of growing season. So they're using spontaneous fermentation, and then they let it macerate there for an extended period of time. almost longer, significantly longer. In many cases, twice the time is the Rosso di Montepulciano. And after that, it gets 18 months in large casks and small barriques. So we talk about large casks. They can be anywhere from 2, 3, 4, 5,000 liter and up, 10, 20, 30. And barriques, once again, are the small barrels, 225 liters typically. And what that means is in the large casks, the wood is very thick. They're used for a long time, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, sometimes more. They're cleaned out each time. The barriques are very thin wood, often toasted, and the amount of toast makes a big difference. Also, some people really want to use barrique, and many people were doing it in the 80s. They were using all new barrique, sometimes 200% new. They would do 100% new barrique for the first year, and then another 100% new barrique for the second year. So there's the big question here is, you want to use small barrels? No problem. They have much thinner wood, so there's much more transference from the inside and the outside, and much more surface area in contact with the wine in a smaller barrel, because there's a larger proportion of barrel to wine in a smaller barrel. So the big question here is, how are they new or used? And if they're used, how used are they? That's one. And B, what if they're new, what is a toast? Because the barrels are kind of typically toasted on the inside. Is it a light, medium, or strong toast? That makes a huge difference. But so three very different things. And now the really thing that distinguishes the Grandi Annate is just the fact that they're not made. This is only made in what they consider to be the very best vintages, and they do a selection of the best plots during that vintage when they decide to make it. So that is the distinguishing factor. Now we have two other producers in Classico portfolio making Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. Capinetto makes a Reserva. So what does Reserva mean? More aging time. And it requires, the Reserva category always requires longer aging than the non-Reserva category of a given appellation requires. So interesting blend here, 70% Prugnolo Gentile, 30% Canaiolo, and a few others, but typically the Sangiovese Canaiolo combination, we see that a lot. 2 years in oval casks that are 5 and 10,000 liters, should be, and small barriques, small barrels. After that, about 6 to 8 months of fining in bottle, which means at the end of the day, we're talking 3 years of aging. Boscarelli, on the other hand, once again, a majority of Sangiovese. This is the driving factor in Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, just like it is in Chianti and many other wines in Tuscany. Here, besides Canaiolo, there's also 2 other grape varieties, Mamolo and Colorino, which you get the name Colore. It was a grape variety that was typically planted in vineyards of Sangiovese to give a little bit more color. Here, they indicate the soil makeup where their vines grow. Alluvial and sandy, limey soils has a big impact on the wines. Typically, they make wines that are much finer, more delicate, don't have the body and structure of clay, limestone soils. 18 to 24 months in larger, let's see, 500 liters is a tonneau, up to 3,500 liter casks. So a little bit of variation there. And most people, many people now do mix. People who are using barrique might use 100%, or they might use 10%, and you do the rest in a large cask. We'll also see some blending between a small percentage in wood and the rest in stainless steel. It's all open as far as the aging protocol. You just have to meet the minimum required time for each appellation and each category within each appellation. So moving over into Montalcino. Another very, very important wine, one that has captured a lot of attention outside of Tuscany, and especially among collectors. Also an historic wine growing area, although, Vino Nobile was probably more highly reputed longer ago. It's much more recent in Montalcino as far as the creation of this particular style of wine. It was really, as far as we know, it was really developed started to be developed in the 19th century, middle to late 19th century. It got its DOC in 1966, so one of the first. But Vernaccia di San Gimignano got it before that, so same year. But they can't claim to be the first DOC appellation. Elevated to a DOCG in 1980, also one of the first. 1980 was the first, the year that the first DOCG appellations were being created. Remember, I mentioned that one of the criteria for obtaining a DOCG appellation is that it had to have been a DOC for at least 10 years. Here too, just like Prugnolo Gentile is the name for Sangiovese in Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, or in Montepulciano, I should say. That's what they call the grape, and that's what they've always called the grape. They thought it was a different grape than Sangiovese. They couldn't analyze it genetically. Same thing happened in Montalcino. They called it Brunello. Brunello, little dark one, Bruno, little dark grape. And the fact is that for a long time it was considered to be a different grape variety, or some people considered it to be a different variety of Sangiovese. In fact, it's genetically, now we can map things so we can really know. Genetically, it's identical. It's Sangiovese. However, the Sangiovese in the area of Montalcino tends to express itself differently in appearance and in characteristics, viticultural characteristics. So go figure. And it's a little bit of controversy in the wine world. Many people will call that a biotype. So it's a grape variety that has the same genetic makeup, but expresses itself differently and appears to be different in different areas. It mutates, but very subtly, doesn't change the genetics. We'll see a number of those. So within Montalcino, there are 7 subzones. Okay, got it there. 7 subzones within the growing area. It makes a big difference if you're on the north, on the south, or on the east. You can see that the eastern part around here is really one of the most highly regarded, maybe the Classico of the Classico in this area. And one of the outstanding things about this wine, at least for Italian wine, it doesn't make a huge difference perhaps, but this has the longest minimum aging requirement of any wine appellation in Italy, minimum of 4 years. For a minimum, it's pretty long. You can always go beyond that. But as a minimum requirement, 4 years is a long time. Remember, minimum requirement for Barolo is 3 years. Minimum requirement for, I don't want to go to other types of wine, but 4 years is quite a long time. So this is the longest required minimum aging of any wine in Italy. It would probably go more than most others. There's a Reserva version, which is 5 years. So quite a long time. And here too, just like in Montepulciano, there are 2 different appellations from Montalcino. They're closely connected, like brother and sister, or brother and brother, first tier, second tier, however you want to think of it. But they're same producers, in many cases the same area. So it gives producers a possibility of declassifying a wine that they normally make in a given area for Brunello. If it's not like a great vintage, they don't want to compromise their reputation, so they'll declassify it and make it into a Rosso. You can do that. You can't do it the other way around, of course. And also the aging requirements for the Rosso are much less stringent. Now there's a lot of Brunellos here, so let's kind of pick and choose what we've got going. Um, they're all very interesting. Daniela Colombini Cinelli. Cinelli is a very old name in Montepulciano in Italy. This is an interesting story because this winery was created by Daniela Colombini Cinelli, an old family in Brunello, in Montalcino, and she wanted to do something a little bit different. She wanted to create a winery that was really staffed by women to get their input and the particular opinion or taste preferences or other things that women bring to the table. So the winery was, and she inherited this property from her family and developed this winery. It was created in 1998. One of the things they do here, their winery is practically in the vineyards, and so they have a practice, a policy that within 30 minutes of picking the grapes, they have to be into the fermentation area and beginning the process. They don't want them sitting around very long. This is a property that's been in the family since the 1500s. And because the winery is so close, once again, they conduct the fermentation for these Brunellos spontaneously by yeasts that are floating around in the air, ambient yeasts, and they use first tonneau 500-liter barrels for the first period of the aging process, and then in large cask for 34 to 36 months, and that's a total of about 48. And that is the minimum aging period before a Brunello can be released. So you see, there is the middle one is there's a regular Brunello, DOCG. Like I said, with Barolo, we could say Classico because we don't want to say regular. It's a DOCG wine. It's a very prominent, important wine. Then there's a reserva version, which gets longer aging. So that is 5 years of overall aging compared to minimum of 4. The one in the middle is very interesting, called Prime Donne. It's kind of, I guess it's, I didn't think of it. It's kind of a play on words because Prime Donne means first women. If you say it, it sounds like kind of like prima donna, which is, we have a different meaning for that, which is also the same meaning that can be used in Italy. But so these are, and here they do something very interesting. This wine is really created by a team of 4 women, along with the owner, of course, Daniela. And they've changed a little bit over the years from the first time they did it to now. But still, there's a small group of women that get together and they taste all of the different lots of individually vinified wine, and they decide what the blend. It's all Sangiovese, Brunello, but what the blend of the different lots and parcels of wine is going to be, and how it's going to be aged, and what kind of size containers they're going to use for the fermentation and for the aging. So very interesting wine, and would be different. Of course, this would be a great lineup for tasting the difference between 3 different Brunellos from the same winery, and made in very similar ways. Of course, they're all ambient yeast fermentation. They're all made from Sangiovese, from the same for the same area, the same vineyards, but each one would be a little bit different as well. Fulini is a producer we're going to be looking at a number of times. They have about 14 hectares on the eastern side of Montalcino, so one of the classic areas. This is kind of interesting. Their enologist, the one who really oversees the winemaking, has been there. I mean, this is his whole life. His father worked as the enologist there with the father of the current owner. So this is sort of a second generation kind of relationship going on. You see there, here too, we have a regular and or a classic and a reserva version. The main difference here is aging, of course, but in this case, they only produce a reserva in what they consider to be great vintages. If it's not a great vintage, they'll just do a great Brunello Classico. In certain vintages, they'll designate certain parcels to undergo this extended aging period. So 5 years of aging overall, with about 3.5 of those years in wood. And once again, they use different sizes. Part of it is in these tonneaux, and 3/4 of it in larger casks. And usually these are the thick wooded casks, usually made of Slavonian oak. And the same dynamic is here with Ridolfi, a Classico and a Reserva. Mercatile, it gives it a name because the area where the winery is located on the northeastern side of Montalcino was considered in times past to be sort of a market area. It's kind of out in the country, outside of the town itself, but that is the reputation that it has. Or maybe it was a kind of a rural sort of exchange where people could trade off animals and things like that. They do a very long fermentation period, and they do it in stainless steel. It's just very slow down. And délestage is a technique of draining out all of the grape must and the liquid in the process of becoming wine, and then pouring it back over again. So it gives it more air, and there's a pump over thing where it's a kind of a continuous circular system of taking the juice, the liquid out of the bottom and pumping it back over the top to have it run through this cap of pomace. But délestage is different. It drain out all of the liquid, the must or the wine, depending on where it's at in its fermentation process. So you see very similar protocols that are used. Once again, the big difference here is the time of aging. And once again, there's a difference between aging as part of the winemaking process, and we really call, and in wine they don't really call it invecchiamento. It's not really invecchiamento. It's maturazione. It's a maturation process, or finamento. It's a refining process where the wine is refined. It settles. Now in this aging period, the wine is developing. It's not just sitting there getting old. It's in wood, so there's a very gentle oxidation where the air travels into the wine and out. So it creates a sort of it's breathing. And that helps the wine really develop and refine. And in French, in some cases, they call it élevage, and then it's kind of growing in some ways. Once you put it into the bottle, okay, then it rests. It's stable. It's closed with a cork closure. There is still some very, very small amount of oxygen exchange. You don't want it to get oxidated, but you don't want to have it get reduced either over a long period of time. Those are two opposites, reduction and oxidation. So it's a question of balance. You don't want too much air, but you don't want no air at all. So in bottle, it starts to evolve. It's not really, time is passing, so I guess you could say it's aging, but if it's in a bottle, well stored, once it's released, you can choose to let it evolve further if you feel like it's going to improve over time with this additional time evolving in the bottle. Hard call to make sometimes. However, Brunello is one of those wines that has the capacity to evolve positively over a very long period of time. I'm going to try not to go as long as we did last week, so I'll keep moving, try to leave some time for questions. Okay, so Fanti, you can see here quite a lineup of wines. There are 4 of them. First, there's a Rosso that then creates kind of a stepping stone to the Brunello. Very similar growing area. The aging is a big difference here. The maturation. Now I'm getting myself in trouble. Aging is easy to say. The maturation or the refining in wood is similar. but longer. And here the vineyards are in the area of Castelnuovo dell'Abate. You can see there's a big range of altitudes here, and the alcohol is a little bit higher, 14.5 compared to 14. Then they have another one that is, it's a kind of like a proprietary bottling, you could say, Brunello di Montalcino Valocchio. This comes from when they choose to make it. They don't necessarily make it every year, but it comes from 5 particular vineyards in Castelnuovo dell'Abate that had a particular reputation in this area of Valocchio to be of higher quality. And here they mention, I think it's for the first time so far, this galestro is a type of soil that is very typical of Tuscany, and especially of the Chianti area, which is a crumbly clay schist-like soil. So it's kind of like broken up, and it's metamorphic rock, which is of volcanic origin. So a bit more aging here. Remember, 4 years is a minimum for a Brunello. So 2 years of that is in wood combination, a year and a half in bottle, and then the rest is just sitting there in bottle before it's released. Then there's also a Reserva, which once again is only made in excellent vintages for them, higher level of alcohol. 24 months in tonneau. Well, it has to be, there's a little bit of confusion there. It has to be at least 5 years. So I wasn't sure exactly what to put. There seemed like a kind of a discrepancy there, but it needs, if it's 24 months in wood, it has to spend the three years in somewhere else in bottle to classify as a Reserva. And this is a very small vineyard. It was planted by the founder of Fanti in 1980, about 250 meters above sea level. And here too, you have this classic galestro soil. 2 others. Costanti is a very, very prestigious producer in Brunello. They go back in Siena, trace their roots to the 15th century, and they were really one of the instrumental people, Costanti, in the creation of the wine that we know now of as Brunello around 1870. So very big impact on the area and the appellation overall. They only have 10 hectares of vine. They're pretty high up, 440 meters. And they use typically for their Brunello, this is their classic Brunello, 14 days of fermentation, kind of short. 18 months in 500-liter barrels, 18 months in large casks, and 12 months in the bottle. So a nice mix there. And La Palazzetta, longer maceration, about 20 days. And they use large casks here, but using French oak, not Slavonian oak, and then 6 months in bottle to reach that 4-year aging period. And they're also located in Castelnuovo dell'Abate. So Morellino di Scansano. Now we're moving out of the comfort zone of Chianti, Brunello, Montepulciano. This Morellino is another local name for Sangiovese. Yeah, there are 4, maybe 5. This is what Morellino is, what they call Sangiovese in the area of Scansano, which is near the Maremma, getting closer to the coast. It is Sangiovese, but it's different. It tastes different. People thought it was its own unique grape, and they compared it to a small type of cherry called Morello. Morello cherries are, quite dark and round, and Morellino would be a small Morello cherry. So the grapes themselves are quite smaller. Located in the coastal area around Grosseto, which is an important port for, not as important as Livorno, but an important port for Tuscany. And here, of course, getting near the coast, the hills are lower. We saw it on the topographical map, and they're lower. The slopes are much more gentle, and you get much more Mediterranean influence, of course, because it's closer proximity. So here we are. Morellino di Scansano DUCG is the appellation, and we're talking about Fattoria Le Pupille, which was another really instrumental winery in the creation of this wine. They didn't invent it, but we could say they pretty much put it on the map. It was really Elisabetta Gepetti who kind of they were growing grapes there, but they were really doing other things with the land. It wasn't that important. People were mostly growing grapes for their own consumption, making wine for their own consumption. In the 1970s, Elisabetta Gepetti, who kind of grew up on this estate as a child, mostly in the summertime, teamed up with a very important, then kind of emerging enologist called Giacomo Takis, and they kind of took Morellino to another level. The estate has about 75 hectares, and they produce about 500,000 bottles a year. So that's significant. Here too, we see the same dynamic between a Classico or regular bottling and a Reserva. A lot of things in common. I guess you could say that the Morellino is maybe a little bit more traditional, using Sangiovese with Alicante and Ciliegiolo. Fermentation in stainless steel with 6 months aging in stainless steel. So here it's all stainless steel. There's no wood component to it. So you get the kind of straightforward varietal character. Various vineyards, and now here you see the altitudes are much lower, 50 to 250 meters above sea level. And here there's much more sand, clay, gravel, and some places you find these iron deposits, which kind of turn the earth red. The Reserva obviously gets much longer aging. Here, 15 months, most of it in large casks of Slavonian oak. And it's a combination of different specific vineyards. They might change sometimes from one vintage to another, but this is pretty much their lineup. They're in different places in the area. And here too, you get the impact of this iron in the soil there. Okay, now we're moving into Super Tuscans, and hang on to your seats because there are quite a number of them. So Super Tuscan, you remember in the beginning we were talking about changes and developments that were taking place in Italian wine in the post-World War II period, especially in the 70s and early 80s, when a new generation was becoming more influential in their family wineries. They wanted to kind of move outside the box, like young people often want to do. They wanted to explore different possibilities, and that has to do with grape varieties, winemaking techniques. They had a different perspective on things than their parents did, and that's how things move and develop over time, of course. So let's begin with Les Pupilles. They're making a lot of wines that are outside of the box. They created this category, one could say, largely of Morellino di Scansano, and now they're kind of moving, exploring outwards of that. Of course, they have been for a while. Safredi is one of these wines that made a big impact as a Super Tuscan outside the box. And these are, now we're going to get into much more IGT appellations, Indicazione Geografica Tipica. So this is one of them from the Maremma, the first release. This was also made with Giacomo Takis, a very influential, important enologist for Italian wine, especially during this kind of Renaissance period for wine. First released in 1987, and this is a blend of non-Italian varieties: 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, 35% Merlot, and 5% Petit Verdot. We could call it a Bordeaux blend. New Barriques for 80% of the wine. So that container has a big impact on the overall wine. Part of it is the new wood, the toastiness of the inside of the barrel. And because it's new, the clogs of the wood are not poured, so they are not closed. So the pores are much more open. There's much more exchange between inside and outside, if that's a positive thing. Avignonesi, the producer that we talked about in Montepulciano as being very influential, are also doing a lot of things in the Super Tuscan category. And you see here, let's look at the Cantaloro. They make a line of these wines called Cantaloro, red, white, and rosé. They're meant to be simple, everyday value wines, very pleasant, very, very pleasing, low alcohol. They're very nice. There certainly is a place for that, and I'm sure that knowing Avignonesi, I'm sure that these are very, very well balanced. That's an important thing. Griffi is considered to be certainly an important Super Tuscan wine. It's kind of found a place for itself. It's not like some of the others, but very solid reputation. Classic Super Tuscan blend of Sangiovese and Cabernet Sauvignon. The two wines are fermented separately and then blended together. After that, 18 months of aging in wood, a majority of that in barrique, and some of the Cabernet Sauvignon and all of the Sangiovese only get aged in large cask. Then there's another one from Sangiovese called Desiderio, 100% Merlot. There's a fun story. I won't go into it behind where they got the name from. The Chianina Valley is very well known for its beef. That's the meat is used for the bistecca alla Fiorentina. I won't go beyond that. So this one is macerated for 2 to 3 weeks and then spends about 20 months in barriques. Here you see they made an indication 15% of them are new. So that means 85% of them are being rotated 1, 2, and 3 years old. Cignale is a winery that was really created by an importer, Neil Empson, and his wife, Maria, from a vineyard near Greve in Chianti. 90% Cabernet Sauvignon and 10% Merlot, 3 weeks maceration and about 2 years in barrique. Interesting soil makeup here, high in schist and with a lot of manganese and nitrogen, which they feel has a big impact on the grapes. Here's another wine of Carpinetta Fontalpino. It's a Toscana, EGT Toscana, as actually these all are, a blend, another Bordeaux blend of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Petit Verdot. And they do fermentation in cement and then additional aging in barrique. Cement is really making a comeback. Many people use that in the 50s, 60s, and many of them still exist. Although, it's having a comeback because it's a neutral fermentation vessel, and some people are really returning to that and even installing new cement tanks instead of pulling them out. Back with Fulini again, they make a wine called SJ for San Jacopo. It's mostly, they say mostly Sangiovese Merlot. They didn't give any exact percentages from the Fulini vineyards in the area of Bandita, and spends about a wide range of time. So I'm not really sure. Maybe they change it from year to year in French tonneau, 500-liter barrels. And it creates, this is meant to be sort of fresher, simpler, typical wine than the other ones we saw from them. Compaccio, 40% Sangiovese, 30% Cabernet Sauvignon, 30% Merlot. These are vineyards. This is interesting because it's a blend of vineyards from Rada in Chianti Classico, and then other vineyards, probably for the Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, in the Maremma, near the coast area. So I think that would be quite an interesting combination of grape varieties, yes, but even more of these two different growing areas. The Poggio Torto is Sangiovese, Merlot, Syrah, and Cabernet Sauvignon. Here too, there's a mix of wood containers, and sometime in bottle, about 14.5 degrees. Interesting here, you have the classic Galestro, and then there's also Abarese, but another typical soil of the central Tuscany area, which is a little bit more compact, not as it's broken up and not metamorphic compared to the Galestro. And this is Fanti is a very old estate, and they make a lot of wines. They date their winemaking traditions back into 1800. Once again, in the area of Castelnuovo dell'Abate and Montalcino in Siena. Monte Antico is another Neil Emson creation, classic sort of super Tuscan, but as they like to say, not super price. So it's a very accessible super Tuscan that's kind of made for, drinking now. You don't have to age it. You don't have to spend a lot of money on it. It's, they say, around 13 degrees alcohol, which is a little bit more contained. You could do that every day or even twice a day if you like. The Nottola, a blend of Sangiovese and Petit Verdot. Interesting choice. Usually people use Petit Verdot in Bordeaux. It's used to kind of give a little hint of spice and acidity, but here it's playing a significant role. Let's see, Supremus, another Neil Emson creation, heavily weighted with Sangiovese, with the Merlot Cabernet Sauvignon as well. Once again, a mix of vineyards in Chianti and in the Maremma, different growing characteristics, certainly. Togliani is also Donna Laura, which is Leah Banville. Very interesting that she is an importer, created an import company of Italian descent. And you see here also the Ali, which is a very fresh, simple wine for drinking young. And so this is another Leah Banville production. And then Via Pilo, Cingalino and Bogaforte, two super Tuscans with different blends. The Cignalino is 65% Merlot and 35% Cabernet Sauvignon. And then the Bogaforte introduces half, 50% Sangiovese into the mix. Much longer aging for the Bogaforte, about twice the amount as the Cignalino. And both of them use French barriques, and they specify the producer, Tavern Sod. So, people who use barrique seriously, it has each producer has their own style, and each the wood from different forests has its own style as well. One more page of Super Tuscans, another from, well, we've seen these producers all before. Fanti, this is a Rosato. We have two Rosatos here from Sangiovese. Of course, to make a Rosato from Sangiovese, it's a red wine, so there's a very short maceration period just to get a little tint of the skins. And Sangiovese, like Nebbiolo, does very, very well as a Rosato because they have naturally medium to high level of acidity to begin with. So they work very well for that, both still and sparkling also. And then Caprinetto, you probably have seen some of the Dogaiolo wines. There's a Bianco, a Rosso, and I think they also do a Rosato. And once again, these are kind of, very accessible, simple, which is not bad. It's not a criticism at all. These are ones that you just drink and you enjoy, and you don't really need to think about them too much because they're just very nice and balanced and fresh, and you can taste the grapes, and there certainly is a very important place for them. Then there is this other wine that Caprinetto makes, Farnito. It's also an IGT, Rosso, Toscana. 100% Cabernet Sauvignon from a specific area, or areas, I should say, Gavil near Firenze and Chianciano near Montepulciano. And it undergoes a pretty strict aging regimen after fermentation. It goes into small barrels until January, which is not that long, and then 8 months in bottles. So the impact of the wood is there, but not too predominant. Let's put it that way. One more thing we have to talk about is Vinsanto, a very special wine. It's a passito wine made from grapes that have undergone appassimento, from the verb passire, to dry out or shrivel up. And this is really a specialty of Tuscany. They make Vinsanto in many areas of Italy. They make passitos. Almost every region has its own kind of passito tradition. Vinsanto is a very particular tradition, especially in Tuscany. And we won't talk about them too much because we don't have any of them. But there are 4 appellations in Tuscany just for Vinsanto, their own appellation. And then you can do a Vinsanto option in many other appellations, but it doesn't have its own appellation. It's just an appellation with Vinsanto added onto it. So Vinsanto, of course, means holy wine. Usually what's used for it in Tuscany is Trebbiano Toscano and Malvasia Bianca Lunga, as well as some others that are approved for it. These clusters are very carefully selected to make sure that they are sound, that they're not, there's no disease, they're not, none of the berries have been crushed or missing, and then they are either hung up or laid out on mats to dry, and you can see them hanging on the right there. And they undergo this appassimento process for several months. They really, and in fact, in many cases, many people leave them there. There's a minimum requirement, which I think is January, February, perhaps, but many people leave them there longer, like, so that they might be pressing the wine and fermenting the juice around Holy Week in the springtime before Easter. So some people say that's partly, that might be where the name came from. But once the grapes are pressed, and fermented, the wine goes into small barrels, and you can see them over there in the back. And these barrels are very special. They're small, about 50 liters. They can range in size to some extent, but they're small barrels. And they're used over and over and over again. They'll take the Vinsanto out of the barrel when they need to put in the new wine for its aging after it's been fermented. But 2 things happen. When they take the wine out of it, they leave whatever the dregs are. It's not pomace because that's been taken out, but whatever the dregs, the lees, the solids that settle to the bottom are left inside there, and intentionally, because that helps really kind of induce this almost kind of secondary, it's not really a fermentation, but a secondary process where the new wine interacts with this old wine, and it blends together. That's one thing. The dregs are left in the barrel. The other important thing is that the barrels are only filled partially, 50, 70%, to allow this sort of gentle oxidating exchange to occur. And the barrels, once they're filled partway, the barrels are sealed and they're left there for the entire aging process, which could be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years or more. It's usually sweet, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be dry. There's a very unusual rare version called Occhio di Pernice, which is made from Sangiovese, so it's red. We have 2 and sort of 3 of them here. One is from Fanti, from San Antimo, a town. So this is Trebbiano Toscano, Malvasia Bianca Lunga, and San Colombano that are allowed to dry for 6 months. And then they spend 6 years in Caratelli. The Avignonesi is also made from Trebbiano Toscano and Malvasia Bianca Lunga. They might have a few other types of grapes in there, but primarily those. and spends 10 years in Caratelli. Then there's the Campobello, and they don't really call it, to their credit, they don't really call it Vinsanto, they call it Il Santo, because this is made by maybe some appassimento perhaps, but it's really a fortified wine. It's fortified with grape brandy to a very subtle extent. So they probably do some drying on the grapes, vinify it, and then fortify it. So they stop the fermentation process probably by addition of this grape brandy to make a slightly fortified wine. And this wine, Campobello, is really the creation of Opici Wine and Spirits. So that is it. Whew. Are there any outstanding questions?
Yes, Alan, I have a question for one of my guys. Can you talk about, or do you know what's going on about the tariffs?
Oh. No, I don't. I really don't. I haven't been following it. I'm trying not to follow it, but I really am hoping that before they can take place, they'll be discontinued, because last time around there was a threat of that, and it really would have had a major negative impact on not just Italian wine, but European wine in general, and not just on the producers in Italy, but on everybody in the United States. It was like the most, when I heard that they were planning 100% tariffs last year, if you remember, and the national wine community was like, what are we going to do? Because it would have been a disaster. And once again, many of the producers in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany, they can find other markets for their wine. Many of their wines are allocated. They don't produce enough of them. So they would find other producers. Would they feel the hit? Yeah, but they would find ways to other people to buy the wine. It would have been a disaster for the United States, for everybody that is connected with the wine industry. And that, I mean, Dario, you know better than me, importers, distributors, delivery people, salespeople, retailers, restaurants. I mean, and even domestic wine producers were not in favor of that. They thought they would have a bad impact for them too, because they're distributors, they're retailers, and it would have been really, probably many of them would have go out of business. So, I'm really hoping that it will be. I understand that it was probably passed. I don't know what the implications of it or when it's scheduled to take place, but it would be a disaster for mostly for the United States. So hopefully it will be. If it's been passed before it can take effect, it will be shut down.
Thank you, Alan. Also, I want to thank you because today was, as always, a huge amount of information and knowledge from your part. I really appreciate it. I know my guys and everybody else that been participating had, a great time and got, a lot out of it.
Good.
So thank you again. And I look forward, unless there is anybody that has a question that you want to bring up. Anybody? We're good? Okay, then we'll see you, Alan, and everybody else next Saturday. Yeah.
Thank you all very much for your attention. Hope you're enjoying it and finding it useful.
Absolutely. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you on next Saturday. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye. Stop recording.